Catus Maximus here, this time with a review of the Hanson and Craftsman spiral external screw extractors. Also, I'm including the master set of the super stubby spiral internal screw extractors, just because I didn't want to do an individual review of just this set alone. I thought that would be just a little bit excessive. So we decided to do it as a review and comparison of Craftsman and Hanson. These Craftsmans are a bit older American-made sets, and Hanson, even to this day, I believe, is also American-made tools. Hanson has been a pretty big name in taps and dies, and so many times that's how people will have become familiar with their brand names. They're often sold at places like Ace Hardware as the more premium grade. Now, what I mean by spiral screw extractors, I've done a review of some Harbor Freight extractors and some straight and pin type extractors. These are the ones that go on the outside of the bolt. Actually, let me get a smaller one to show you all here. So how these work is inside they have a tight spiral, and it's also in the shape of a cone. So there are these 3 round holes that are drilled at maybe 15-degree or 20-degree angles. And what ends up happening is you take them and you put them, find one that fits the tightest, and you put it over the end of the fastener, and you tap it a couple times just to get it seated. And like on these Craftsman low profile ones, once you get it seated, then you would insert, in this case, a 3/8 inch drive ratchet, and very carefully keeping the extractor straight, and that's one of the hardest things to do, is actually keep it straight. It will thread itself onto the end of the fastener, and because it has a taper, it will continue to get deeper and deeper grip or cutouts in the end of the bolt, and either the bolt will break or it will start to unscrew. And some of the worst case scenarios on softer bolts or really heavily corroded bolts, these extractors can slip, and when they do, they just machine a taper on the end of the bolt, and then you basically have to grind the head off at that point. So if these type of sockets don't work, they can make it next to impossible to get out if they end up ruining the end of the fastener anymore. But they tend to be quite reliable, especially if you find the one that is just the absolute tightest fitting, and that's the case here. You want to make sure that it just barely fits over the head of the fastener so it can get a nice deep grip. What often happens is you get one that's just too big and it sinks down too deep, and then there isn't any space. Let's see, get some light in here. Jeez. There we go. You can see that the fluting only goes so deep, and so you really got to make sure that you find a nice tight fitting one. Now, if we're going to compare to the Hansons, the Craftsmans, here's what the Hansons look like. They're not perfect. They're very good in some ways, but they're not quite as good in other ways. Now, the difference with the Hanson and the Craftsman is the fact that the Craftsman doesn't have the hex on it, so it's much smaller diameter and can fit in basically any place that a normal socket can fit, you know, in the recesses, etc. You can get this extractor into. Or the more traditional style is this, where they actually have a hex. What is interesting is the quality of the build. If you can see here, let me get that light again. There we go. You can see that the hexes, like on the Craftsman here and the Hanson, are actually all drilled and broached, so they're using an older, a bit more expensive manufacturing process, just because they don't make quite as many extractors as they do with sockets. And the deal with the hex one is you can drive it with a 3/8, or if you're in a real tight spot, then you can just use a ratcheting wrench or just a regular box wrench. One thing I was also going to say is the Hansons are machined down from a billet piece of steel, or the Craftsmans are one-piece forged. The forging is going to be a bit stronger because it causes all the grains to align more in the shape of a socket, where when you just have hex stock and then machine it down, technically it isn't quite as strong. And that's one thing. Hansons have always been nice, but I've always had, they always seem to kind of wear or be a little bit soft. And it may be more intended for them to get a little bit of extra grip and not be as likely to suddenly fail under situations where you're using extractors. But I will mention, some people have commented about snap-on tools not being the hardest, but it's like a compromise. Hansons are kind of the same way. But they are really well machined. When you fit these onto a 3/8 ratchet, they are really, really tight. And I did want to mention that. They have excellent tolerances. Now, most of these sets usually come with the ability to remove from 8 to 10 millimeter. The Hanson will go down to 8. The Craftsman only goes to 10. And both go up to 3/4 of an inch. You do have an extra increment in the Craftsman set, just because it goes from 10 through 19 millimeter 9 pieces, where the Hanson goes from 8 to 19 millimeters in 19 pieces. So the next ones we have to talk about are these Craftsman super low profile spiral screw extractors. These you really got to make sure that you find a tight fitting one because they're very narrow. Now if we're going to take this 3/4 inch one, and this is where these can really come in handy, is because if you're in any kind of a tight situation, oftentimes these extractor sockets are pretty tall and don't always fit. The other issue is because of the way they're standing off and these sharp points that are trying to screw themselves on via a taper, they really want to rock around, and it can be difficult to make sure they stay on straight. So then one nice aspect of these low profile ones is that you're driving it really close to the center line of where the spirals are versus being offset, so you don't have this tendency to want to rock these style as much. They cannot be driven with the ratchet. They can only be driven with a, another socket or a wrench. But for that sacrifice, you get a spiral extractor that is less than half the height of any equivalent standard height spiral extractor. And you can see it's about half the height of the Hanson. In this case, the Hanson's actually a little bit shorter than the Craftsman. And so in this situation, you actually have 3 different heights, and you have more versatility. I will also say, for some reason, this Craftsman set here came with 10 pieces instead of the 9, so it has just a little bit more granularity. And it also is kind of frustrating because you have one set and then the other, and there may be a situation where you have the one size here that doesn't exist there. And so to go ahead and finish off this review, this is the Hanson 25-piece master internal screw extractor set. Another thing, Hanson doesn't coat their tools at all, so whenever you get Hanson tools, you got to make sure to oil them, and because they really like to corrode. I've actually had this set for 15 years, so I've done a pretty decent job keeping it from corroding, but you really do have to oil these. This 25-piece set's actually pretty nice. We'll give you a nice close look. It goes from 1/8 inch or 1/8 inch drill through 7/8 inch drill, and see, this one's about the same size as my thumb here. It's a huge internal extractor, and it's only as tall as any of those other extractor sockets we just looked at. This is a 30 seconds increment. It is every increment from an 1/8 inch through 7/8 inch by 30 seconds. And so you can find just the absolute perfect size extractor, and that's important for these style small compact spiral extractors, because they don't have a lot of taper and a lot of flute. So when you drill the hole, these just barely fit in on the tip, and then they start to thread in. You'll find once they get about halfway or so, sometimes a bit more, then the fastener finally breaks. Now, an issue, and I forgot to mention on my previous video about those Napa extractors, is that the hole is drilled, real close to the absolute size of the fastener, like you're almost drilling out the fastener. And that's because you want to have as thick a shank as possible for the extractor to get the torque you need, because it's very easy to break off extractors. Well, the issue with that is because you have such thin walls, and it's really hard to drill out a fastener, absolutely in the center. Even if you make sure to center punch, it's just hard to do it like you're on a milling machine. The walls of the fastener can crack as this draws in, and it can make the situation sometimes worse because it'll slip because it's actually causing the fastener to expand out and wanting to lock up. This can become a real issue, say in aluminum intake manifolds, where you have like a little vacuum nub, a little steel nub that a hose connected to. It broke off, and you're trying to extract the remainder of it, and it's sitting on a boss, which is just a post, with the hole in it where the fitting went. And as this is screwing in, trying to get enough torque to extract whatever broke, the boss of the aluminum will crack. And so you have to be real careful with internal extractors, and that's why the straight extractors are more popular, because you tap them in, but they don't thread in on a taper as aggressively, and so you're less likely to cause an overexpansion issue where you damage something. And just to give you a quick look here, that's absolutely what happens is especially with the small ones where it's just hit or miss whether the bolt will unscrew or whether extractor will break off. When you get to the larger extractor sizes, the less tendency they have to break and the more likelihood you are to actually successfully remove a fastener. About the wear that I was talking about regarding the Hansons, we have two Hanson 1/8 inch here. And this is obviously the new one, and then this is the used one. And you can see where I've used this twice. Admittedly, they were on number 10 hardness fasteners, and so they were pretty hard, which means they'll be hard on the tool. But you can see it really flattened out the flutes pretty severely just using this a couple of times. This extractor itself has maybe a couple, 3 more uses really, especially in hard fasteners before it just becomes too smooth to even be able to thread in as compared to how sharp they are. And so extractors, I did want to mention, happen to be have a short lifespan. They really do. So what ends up happening is you buy a set, and then whatever ones that you use and break, you just try to find the best replacements that you can. Alrighty, I think that's enough talk about spiral extractors. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Catus Maximus out.